Hi, I'm Jorge Caballero, traveling guitarist and professor of guitar at Rutgers University, and welcome to this video. This is I'm going to call it an in-depth type video lesson situations on some of the didactic repertoire that we have. Now, didactic means it's stuff that you have to learn for the purpose of becoming better technically, looking at situations that are either musically challenging, technically challenging, and the relationship between those two, and they make you a better guitarist. So if you want to, if you have, let's say you have dreams of playing, say, Asturias or Sevilla by Albeniz, or let's say the Rodrigo Concerto, famous, that kind of stuff. Well, you have to actually start with something easier than that to learn what are the problems that we typically handle. And so for that we have very classic repertoire of studies, and namely the ones that we typically use are the Carcassi Etudes and the Sor Etudes. There's a lot of them. Do we have more than 100 Sor Etudes? Probably. In any case, we have a bunch. There's also Leo Brouwer Etudes. These are the more classic etudes. And so today I wanted to focus on Carcassi number 2, which is one of my favorites actually. It's a fun little piece, very effective actually. You could actually perform it. It's fun. And also you learn a couple of very important ideas from working on it. So let's get started. So if you're not familiar with this Carcassi Etudes, you should really familiarize yourself. This typically happens with amateurs that they when they're studying on their own, they don't really learn a lot about the repertoire. That's usually what a teacher does. He or she will introduce you to new repertoire and sort of the things that are more common to study. And so if you're not familiar, you should really familiarize yourself with these. And so Carcassi number 2. I'm going to play bit by bit, not all of it all at once, but let's say it begins like this. Okay, so that's the first section of the etude, and now as you can see, fun stuff to learn. And it features a couple of things that are very important to learn about. Number one, as it pertains to the right hand, it contains a very important idea. The idea of chaining formulas or chaining fingering patterns for the right hand. So as I'm going to show you in a moment what that is, but let me before that say that as far as the left hand goes, it also features something that's also very important, and it's the idea of learning how to shift from a practical perspective. There's a lot of theory about shifting, by the way, and different methods, and different guitarists have predicated different types of ways of shifting. And so there is that. But there's also the practical, strategic element of shifting. And so this etude features these two things. It basically highlights them. And let's discover, first of all, the issues with the right hand. So what you have is a combination of chord situations, say this one. Then the next one will be this. And then here. Then here. Then here. Etc. So as you can see, you have a hand position, and then we have some notes to play on the right hand, and the notes that we play always follow the same order. We play here, 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 and then 4 repeated notes. Okay? Now, to do that, what we rely on is some of the common fingering patterns that we utilize in a lot of repertoire, not just in this piece. And basically we have ideas of how to put these things together and chain them. It is common for us to do this sort of thing. and what I'm doing is basically the same pattern. It's P-I-M-A, and then I'm changing the bass, and that's basically a common pattern that we have in operation when we play the guitar. It's very useful, very, very normal for accompaniment situations. And the other thing that we also do that is very common on the guitar is play repeated notes. Now, in this case, I'm using middle and index fingers. But there are other combinations that are possible, say a more intricate alternation, M-I-M-A, for example. Now, so what Carcassi does in this etude is he has you go from one of these formulas, the P-I-M-A, and then immediately switch to repetition of fingers. As such, we would have this. So you can see how I'm playing P-I-M-A, then followed by, like, say, M-I-M-I on the same string. So this idea of positioning a chord and then shifting the hand to play repeated notes on the same string is a common situation that we have in repertoire. So, we will see it later in further repertoire, so this is a really great starting point for you to train yourself. There are two main fingering options that are available in this etude. The one that I just played, P-I-M-A, followed by M-I-M-I, or the more elaborate P-I-M-A, followed by M-I-M-A. Now, I'm going to play a little bit of the first version with M-I-M-I at the end. Notice that P-I-M-A is always the same in all cases. So, and then I'm going to play, after that, I'm going to play the other one, the M-I-M-A. So you get a sense of how using these different patterns actually changes the nature of the sound of the etude. So, for example, M-I-M-I would do this. Okay, and now notice how the notes at the end of the pattern, the repeated notes, sound very, very sharp. Now, let's change it to M-I-M-A. So, and notice how this has kind of a softer quality to it. The notes are prettier, those repeated notes. So, as a student, you actually want to learn both versions. But usually, if you've never looked at this before, you're not probably going to learn both at the same time or concurrently. What you want to do is you want to focus on the one that seems easiest to you. Let's say, usually as a beginning student or someone who's just starting on this piece, it's easier to use M-I-M-I, although there are exceptions to this. So I would say learn the entire thing using that pattern. And once you've actually learned it well enough, then try to see if you can then change it to the other pattern. Other combinations may be possible, but those are the principal ones. So anyone who has studied this etude, if they've studied it well, they probably know there's two different patterns on it. And some books will advocate one, some books will advocate the other, or the more interesting books actually show you different patterns, which is really nice. But since a lot of material that we get is from the internet and usually doesn't have any information of this type, I thought this would be very useful to remember. So that's what this is about for the right hand. So if you want to practice this separately, for example, you could also do this without a left hand, just that, or any combination, like there, or it's MI, and get your practice that way, and then you can start adding then the left hand later. So, and then try to then place them all without any breaks. Something like that, for example. Now, now I need to talk about the other component of this etude. And the other component of this etude is the left hand. The difficulty here, or the introduction that Carcassi has to shifting, is very, very important because it deals with some of the simpler forms of shifting most of the time. And that means, namely, that you have time to shift. Incidentally, as far as technical things go, a shift is actually more difficult depending on the amount of time that you have. So if you have less time to execute a shift, then the shift is by definition more difficult. When you have more time, then the shift is considered easy. So in this case, he's actually going to show you that this is very easy to play if you notice how much time you actually have to make every shift. And the most available time that you have when you're making a shift when you're playing is when you have an open string to pluck right before you have to make a shift. And so, for example, at the very opening, you're playing here, 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 open string. Now, you have to play now this, 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 and this. All of those are open string notes. So your left hand is actually free to move out of this position and start setting up for the following chord position at any point once you reach the first string, the first open string. So here, so literally there's so much time that I could literally take my arm completely off the fingerboard, and I probably would still get to the other position in time. So here, see, so that's an example of a shift that's actually easy because you have time. And furthermore, there is one more open string that you have to play before you have to put your hand in the new chord position, and that is the bass note. And as luck would have it, most of the time you're going to have that kind of time when you're playing this etude. So it introduces shifts, but it introduces them in a very intelligent way for a student. It doesn't force you to do something that's too difficult where you're going to have to figure out intricate situations and how to get out of them. Of course, this is not all the time, but it is most of the time. And one of the big problems that students have when they learn this piece is precisely that they have a hard time shifting. And as such, what happens, and this is a typical thing that happens and that you need to watch out for when you're playing something like this that involves arpeggios and shifting, is look for the very last 16th note of every pattern and see if you're actually cutting it short or if you're releasing your left hand altogether. So for example, here a common thing that you hear students do is something like this. They play here, something like that. And now that didn't sound bad necessarily, but if you pay attention, there is a problem. This should have been 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And what I played was this. 1, 2, 3, 4. So what happened to that last G sharp that I was playing? Okay, I released it, and the reason students tend to release that note is because they have to make a shift, and so they release their hands. The problem is that they release them too early. They are still supposed to hold the finger one extra 16th note. They just don't do it, and the reason is because they realize they have to make a shift, and they think, well, if I don't do this now, I don't have time. I'm going to get to the new chord position really late, or I might miss it. But if you look carefully, you realize that after this, now you have a bass, and that bass is an open string. So that's when you make the shift. So you go here, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, shift, 1, and then you continue, 3, 4, 1, shift, 1, and you continue. And that's a procedure for something like this. And so that is the target in this etude. And like I said, pretty much all of it is that way, and you have to execute your shifts that way, but not all of it. And so I'm going to show you some of the spots where this is not the case. So far. Right here. So after this, we have to go from here to here. Now, first of all, fingerings are important in a passage like this. Right now, I'm using something that would be considered somewhat unusual if you're a student, but as an intermediate or advanced player, this will actually make a lot of sense. And the fingering that I'm using for this chord is 1, 4, 2. Now, typically that would be played 1, 3, 2. And there's a reason why I'm doing that. The reason I'm using 4 instead of 3, leaving this finger kind of out there to hang, is because of the chord that follows. The chord that follows involves this finger, and then another finger in the left hand that has to play this note. So here's the problem with the shifting in this case. We don't have that open string anymore. We have to go from here immediately to the next chord position. Now, there's technique for that sort of thing. You basically have to be very quick with your hands, and you have to aim very thoroughly. But there's one very practical thing that you can do, which is what I'm doing here. I'm leaving this finger open. And so my intention is I'm going to use this finger for this note over here. And since this finger is already on the third string in this chord, I'm going to use that as a guide or reference point on the fingerboard to get to this note. So here, I can rely on this and then on catching with a finger that hasn't been doing something else. So here, and that allows me a clearer or safer way of getting to that chord position. And that's the reason I'm using that fingering in that case. I would definitely recommend it. Now, it's not the only way to perform this. I mean, we could actually use the more common finger 3 for this chord position, and then, but in that case, the problem is that we have to use finger 2 for this note, which we just used for the G sharp. So this is finger 2 holding down onto this note, and then this finger 2 now has to jump to this note here. So as a result, you might get something like this. Something very forced. And that would be at best. At worst, you might get this, where you release the finger altogether before you're supposed to release it. So this fingering idea is actually very important to understand from a practical perspective when we're looking at shifting, and you're looking at a more complicated shift where you no longer have an open string to make the shift, but you have to actually make it quickly. So the strategy there is to understand where you're going and see if you have a finger that could be available, leave it open so it can get to a note, so you don't have the last finger playing be also the first finger playing in the new chord position. So something like that is a very important thing to learn as a student. You know, like look for more strategic aspects of playing. Don't just, of course, you could rely on brute force and try to get to the chord position, like I said. And there's merit in that as well. But in terms of using your hands appropriately, it actually does violate some basic principles of how we actually play. One of which is commonly talked about, and it says that you should not use more effort in playing than you actually should. So this is an example of not using more effort than you should. Yes, it is a good sign that you are quick enough that you can play this and get to that and try to make it as smooth as possible. But from a practical perspective or a strategic perspective, when you have something easier that you could do, why not do it? So here, so this ends up being easier. So that's one possible solution for this. Then this is followed by this. this fingering is also deliberate here, and this could be played after this with finger 3, but this finger will have an easier time reaching that note. So even though it might look strange at first, or if you're not too familiar with these kinds of positions, then this might feel awkward at first. But if you look at it from the perspective of what you actually gain, then you realize that actually that's a better choice than using the more common position here, which would be 3-2-1 for this chord position, simply because this would force you to make a stretch that your hand is not really going to respond well to. So, like I said, it is possible to do it, but it functions it's just fine. But it might be easier to do this. And then followed by this. Here you have open strings, so then that's not a problem. And then continuing here, basically the same thing. The other parts. In the second section, we'll have a similar situation later in the etude. So just to be clear, the second section of the etude goes like this. This is actually somewhat unusual, the fingering that I'm using, and once again, it has a purpose. The fingering that I'm using here, like this, commonly we don't use these types of fingerings. We use 1 and 2 in reverse. So 1 would be on the 3rd string, the string that's actually higher in the vertical plane, and we will use 2 on the lower point of the vertical plane. And what I'm doing is the opposite. I'm kind of reversing the position. And the reason for that, once again, is if you look ahead. If you look ahead, what you have is this. And this point right here is what justifies that fingering. Of course, you could do this. But it creates a little problem at this point. See, the shift from here to here is more complicated than if I just turn my hand in this direction. So this is, like I said, both. You should be able to do both, or you should practice doing both, or more specifically, commit to one, and then once you actually know it well, then try this other option and see which one you prefer from a musical perspective and from a comfort perspective. But there you have it. And then the point was that after this, I have a lot of open strings, and all I have to do is glide this finger down and then align the other fingers to the position. So this becomes rather easy. So all of these are actually quite easy as far as shifts go. I mean, you have the open string to work with. And then further, like the beginning. Okay, this one seems extremely glamorous if you look at it, because it just, from a visual perspective, it looks like you just went from the top end of the guitar all the way to the bottom, I guess, and looks like a big shift and really difficult and impressive. But it's actually just as simple as all of the others. The point here is that you have once again an open string. Right there. So even though it looks really intricate, it's actually quite simple. And then I'm following the same fingering logic, as this is basically exactly the same as the conclusion of the first portion of the etude. There's a repeat, but kind of an odd repeat, because Carcassi is asking you to repeat the longer section of the etude rather than the shorter section, which sounds from a musical perspective somewhat lopsided. But in any case, that's actually the entire etude that I just ran through in bits. I'll play it continuously. I'll do a run through of it in a moment. But after you look at a study like this, or after everything that we've discussed, there has been one particular instance in this etude that distinguishes itself above all others in terms of difficulty. And that moment was actually kind of it was on measure 4, this. There was nothing else that in terms of mechanical aspects was more difficult than that, except something that happens here. And the only reason that's difficult, or more difficult than the other parts, is because the pattern is not happening for the right hand, that is. The pattern is not taking place on adjacent strings. You have to play your I finger on the 4th string, then M on the 2nd string, and then A on the 1st string. So usually these non-adjacent patterns for the right hand are challenging for the right hand because they are a stretch by definition. It's the equivalent of doing something like this for the left hand. There's a stretch here, so the same thing is happening here. The hand, we're forced to play and hold a stretch to be able to play the notes. But other than that, though, there's nothing else in this etude that is inconsistent in terms of difficulty. It's just different variations of similar ideas, similar mechanical ideas. So here is the etude from beginning to end, and I'm going to use one of the patterns, and then at some point I'm going to shift to the other one. The first pattern I'm going to use is the PIMA, and then followed by MIMA, which is actually kind of the pattern I prefer from a musical perspective. But then later I'm going to switch it to PIMA followed by MIMI, and be interesting if you can actually detect at which point this actually occurs. If you're tuned enough with your ears to figure out how the different patterns actually create a difference in sound. This is useful, by the way, from a different perspective, because you actually learn to pay attention to fingerings even just by listening. So when you're trying to get some ideas as to how to play things, you don't have to rely on somebody telling you exactly how the fingerings are or writing the fingerings down, but actually you can learn to listen to people play and hear the kind of fingerings that they're producing just by sound. That's something that has to be cultivated, so there's never a bad time to get started on that. So here we go. This is Carcassi number 2. So could you tell when I changed the fingerings? If you didn't, here's the answer. Once I got to the second section, here, that's when I changed to the other pattern. And then I actually was wondering when to change it back, actually, because I wanted to go back to my preferred pattern, the MIMA pattern at the end. And so once I got here, I thought about doing it then, and then I changed my mind at the last minute, so then something kind of went off. But once I got here, I went back back to the original pattern. I also changed the fingering in the middle here to try a different option. But things like that are usually possible when you're studying and you reach a certain level when you know the piece, and so you want to consider other types of fingerings. So something like that is actually fun to try as well. Like I said, try different fingering options. And but yeah, that's the etude. In any case, I hope that this in-depth lesson has been useful. I've tried to cover the main ideas of this etude, but from several perspectives. If you're a complete beginner, or if you are not complete beginner, but someone who is just at the point where they're beginning to learn this kind of repertoire, or if you're already familiar with this piece and you've studied it before and you just have a curiosity to see how there may be elements about this etude that you didn't consider, so there's also elements of that as well. And so I hope, once again, that this has been useful. If you have any questions, just write a comment below and see maybe that will actually provide me with some inspiration as well, or some other ideas for other videos that I might make in the future. Thanks very much. I hope you have a good day, and I'll see you next time.